Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Very busy news day today. We've got sort of a packed show tonight, lots going on, including a little bit of breaking news that we're going to get to in just a moment. But in the wake of last night's State of the Union address, President Trump today, you may have noticed, he did not set off on any kind of message-driven bus tour or any other kind of political event somewhere out in the country trying to sell the elements of his State of the Union address from last night. Presidents always used to do that. I mean, successfully or not, they would at least try. You remember, like George W. Bush trying to sell his privatized Social Security plan, right? He did this traveling roadshow on that, which ended up making that idea less popular every time he did a new event. But at least he tried. You might remember President Obama and Vice President Biden going off on a road trip and making appearances with preschoolers to try to promote the pre-kindergarten initiative from one of the Obama State of the Union addresses at the start of his second term. And who knows if these kinds of hammer home the message tours actually do anything after a State of the Union address in terms of persuading Congress to pass legislation to effectuate that presidential idea and pass appropriations to fund it. But at least those stunts, those trips, they did at least have the effect of keeping the press focused on the president's message from the speech for a few more days after the biggest speech of the year was over. And those efforts do at least show a president exerting a little bit of energy, right? Trying to at least maybe make a gesture toward selling his key ideas from his biggest speech of the year. This year, it didn't happen. This year, after the State of the Union address last night, they are not even trying anything like that, not with this president. And maybe that makes sense to the extent that the big takeaway message from this State of the Union was the president's somewhat odd declaration that there can be no more investigations of him, with the implied or else threat. I mean, if that's the point of this year's State of the Union, there really is no need for any sort of presidential stunt or bus tour trip to keep the focus on that weird line in the president's speech and that key element of his presidency. I mean, he doesn't need to do anything to change the fact that the ambient news hook events around this State of the Union this year were what happened the day before the address, which is federal prosecutors subpoenaing his inaugural committee, and what happened the day after his address today, when the Intelligence Committee announced the parameters for its renewed investigation of the president, including spelling out the lines of inquiry that have since arisen, that have derived from the original Sin inquiry into Russia interfering in the 2016 presidential election to make Donald Trump president in the first place. And I know you have probably seen headlines today about the Intelligence Committee announcing the parameters of its new investigation now, right? I mean, yes, there was an investigation when the Republicans were in control. They ended early, closed up shop, and said, no collusion. Now the Democrats are in control. Now Adam Schiff is the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Chairman Schiff and the Democrats in his committee will be able to employ subpoena power for that investigation. And you probably saw headlines about them announcing the parameters of that investigation today. But did you actually look at what they announced? I mean, I knew they'd announced something. This is not what I was expecting. This is way more of a capital D doozy than I think anybody was expecting outside this committee. I mean, just check out what they announced today. Quote, in the more than 2 years since the intelligence community released its assessment of Russia's malign influence operation targeting the 2016 U.S. elections, much has been learned about the scope and scale of the attack on our democracy, including how covert and overt Russian activities intersected with individuals associated with Donald Trump's presidential campaign, transition, administration, and business interests, including the Trump Organization. From late 2015 through early 2017, individuals close to Donald Trump engaged in a significant number of contacts with an array of individuals connected to or working on behalf of the Russian government. And several of these contacts involved efforts to acquire and disseminate damaging information about Hillary Clinton and her campaign, or related to Russia's desired relief from U.S. sanctions. quote, during the prior Congress, the committee began to pursue credible reports of money laundering and financial compromise related to the business interests of President Trump, his family, and his associates. Unfortunately, these and numerous other avenues of inquiry were not completed during the last Congress. Now, in this new Congress, the committee's investigation will focus principally on 5 interconnected lines of inquiry, beginning with these incomplete or unexamined investigative threads. And so this is where they say the investigation is going to go from here on out. There's 5 items, and the first 2 of these items are going to sound a little bit familiar to you. Basically, they are in some important ways new, but they're going to sound familiar. Here's the first one. Quote, the Intelligence Committee now says it will investigate, number 1, quote, the scope and scale of the Russian government's operations to influence the U.S. political process and the U.S. government's response during and since the 2016 election. So this is close to the sort of remit that the Mueller investigation was given when Mueller was appointed as special counsel to look into the Russian government's operations to interfere in the 2016 election. But you will note, this is a little broader, right? This is about influencing the U.S. political process more broadly. And it expands from just the 2016 election to include time since the 2016 election as well. So even though that is familiar, that first point, it is also expanded. That's 1. 2, the Intelligence Committee also says that it will investigate the extent of any links and or coordination between the Russian government or related foreign actors and individuals associated with Donald Trump's campaign, transition, administration, or business interests in furtherance of the Russian government's interests. And again, this sounds familiar, right? It sounds familiar from the remit of the Mueller investigation, right? This is collusion. This is looking at whether the Trump campaign was involved in what Russia did. But it is a broader definition, right? Links or coordination between all sorts of people associated with Donald Trump and the Russian government or foreign actors associated with the Russian government. So again, it looks similar to what Mueller's remit is, but it is a little bit broader, including extending into the transition and the current administration. And now, look at this. This is brand new. The Intelligence Committee is also going to investigate, quote, whether any foreign actor has sought to compromise or holds leverage, financial or otherwise, over Donald Trump, his family, his business, or his associates. This means they are now officially and with subpoena power investigating directly the thing that you shout out in the dark in the middle of the night when you wake up sweating and you thought it was a dream and you didn't realize you said it out loud. You know how you wake up in the night drenched in sweat saying, what if the president is a foreign agent? That's point number 3. They're actually just looking at that. How foreign actors sought to compromise or hold leverage over the president, his family, his business, or his associates, financially or otherwise. Yeah, is the president a Russian agent? Or are his family or his business or his associates, have they been compromised by foreign actors, including Russia? That would be a good thing to know. It would help us all sleep, for one thing. But there's more. Number 4, the Intelligence Committee will investigate, quote, whether President Trump, his family, or his associates are or were at any time at heightened risk of or vulnerable to foreign exploitation, inducement, manipulation, pressure, or coercion, or have sought to influence U.S. government policy in service of foreign interests. In other words, has the Russian government or any other foreign interest succeeded in these efforts? Have they, by any means, succeeded in getting the president or his family or people associated with him to act on behalf of foreign interests when it comes to U.S. policy? So number 1, have they been compromised? Number 2, have they been acting essentially as a Russian or otherwise foreign agent in trying to influence the United States and our policies? Gulp. And lastly, number 5, whether this is the Intelligence Committee, the 5th of their 5 points today. Happy State of the Union, Mr. President. They're also looking into this. They're looking into whether any actors, foreign or domestic, sought or are seeking to impede obstruct and or mislead authorized investigations into these matters, including those in the Congress. So that's broadly obstruction, right? Anybody in foreign countries or here, have they lied to or misled or blocked or attempted to intimidate or otherwise divert the Mueller investigation or any other law enforcement investigation related to this matter or any of the congressional inquiries that relate to this matter? 5 points. And I don't know what the president was hoping for last night when he decided to say in his State of the Union address that Congress shouldn't investigate him anymore or the country gets it. But I cannot imagine this was the desired result of that now indelible and permanent line that will always be part of the history of the Trump presidency and the history of the State of the Union address in America. And these 5 threads that the Intelligence Committee says they're going to investigate, this isn't just a Democratic wish list for what they hope people might look into. This isn't just like a table of contents for stuff to worry about and sweat over in the night. This is now the stated parameters of the new active Intelligence Committee investigation in the House of Representatives under Democratic leadership who have subpoena power. Today, in their first act, the Intelligence Committee also voted to convey witness transcripts to the special counsel, to Robert Mueller. Mueller, of course, has already charged 2 people associated with the president for lying to Congress. Mueller has charged federal prosecutors have charged the president's longtime political advisor, Roger Stone, also the president's longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen. Federal prosecutors have also made reference to Sam Patten allegedly lying to Congress and the plea deal that Patten made over his funneling foreign money into the Trump inauguration. Now, we do not know if anybody else who has testified to the Intelligence Committee is likely to face the same kind of trouble in terms of potential felony charges, potential legal liability for having lied to Congress under oath. But this is a whole lot of transcripts that Mueller received today from the Intelligence Committee. These are a lot of witnesses that we are talking about here, including the president's eldest son and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Trump campaign figures, including Brad Parscale, who's his new campaign manager, and Steve Bannon, who ran the Trump campaign after Paul Manafort, and Hope Hicks and Corey Lewandowski and Eric Prince of Blackwater fame, right? And Keith Schiller, the president's longtime bodyguard. Alexander Nix from Cambridge Analytica, former Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, the president's longtime secretary from his business, Rona Graff. I mean, lots and lots of people. Transcripts amounting to thousands of pages. And again, we don't know if any of those people, any of those witnesses who testified under oath before the Intel Committee, we don't know if any of them are facing the same kind of felony legal jeopardy that Roger Stone and Michael Cohen have run up against and Sam Patten has run up against in their dealings with federal prosecutors. But the conveying of these official transcripts to Robert Mueller's office today means that the special counsel, if they do want to bring legal charges against anyone for false statements in this testimony, the special counsel now has the ability to do that with these official transcripts. So, in terms of what's going to happen next here, don't expect a bus tour from the president to highlight his State of the Union messages, such as they were. The president's longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, had been scheduled to testify in Congress in public tomorrow, in an open-door hearing in Congress before the House Oversight Committee. That has now been delayed after Mr. Cohen said he felt his own safety and that of his family was in jeopardy because of threats from the president. The day after tomorrow, Mr. Cohen had been scheduled to testify behind closed doors to the Intelligence Committee. That, as of today, has also now been put off. They have rescheduled that testimony for February 28th. There's a couple things interesting about that testimony being rescheduled. First of all, I think it's interesting to note that these committees, these members of Congress who were expecting him in his testimony, none of them seem to be angry or dissatisfied with Michael Cohen for this delay. Everybody's saying that Cohen is still being cooperative. They're not upset with him. They do not think that he is dodging them. Congresswoman Jackie Speer today, veteran member of the Intelligence Committee, she told reporters today that this delay should not be blamed on Cohen. She said, quote, "I think he is being very cooperative." She said the delay is, quote, "not at his request." Well, who did want the delay then? Congressman Adam Schiff, the new chairman of the Intelligence Committee, added somewhat cryptically today that the delay of Michael Cohen's testimony was, quote, "in the interests of the investigation." When Congressman Schiff was asked by reporters today to explain what that meant, he helpfully said, Mr. Cohen's testimony was delayed in the interest of the investigation. He just repeated his previous cryptic statement, basically telling reporters, listen, that's all you're getting. And so I think there are a couple things to watch here. As I mentioned, on Monday of this week, on the eve of the State of the Union address, prosecutors from the Southern District of New York did issue a subpoena to the president's inaugural committee. Now, we don't know if that relates at all to this delay in Michael Cohen's congressional testimony, or why delaying his testimony is something that might have been done in the interest of the investigation. But keen-eyed observers have noted that the prosecutor who's named on the subpoena to the inaugural committee is one of the same prosecutors who was involved in prosecuting the Michael Cohen case in the Southern District of New York. So that suggests that perhaps there is some overlap there. It has also been reported that the subpoena to the Trump inaugural committee asked specific questions about one specific donor. Interestingly, a donor who had previously given to Obama and Clinton, who nevertheless became a very enthusiastic Trump donor once Trump won the election. He is mentioned in the subpoena. Specifically, he is reported to have had dealings with Michael Cohen. So it's possible that whatever is going on with this federal investigation and this federal grand jury subpoena to the president's inaugural committee this week, it's possible that that is quite substantively related to Michael Cohen, to whatever's going on in his criminal case right now as he awaits the start of his federal prison sentence a month from today. It may have to do with the delays to what had been expected otherwise to be his congressional testimony this week. Also, there's this new reporting from CNN as of last night, as yet unmatched by any other news organization. But CNN reported last night that prosecutors from the Southern District of New York are also now seeking interviews with Trump Organization executives, meaning with executives from the president's business. Now, why would federal prosecutors be seeking interviews with Trump Organization executives now? We don't know. We know the special counsel's office subpoenaed the Trump Organization almost a year ago. Last March. We know Michael Cohen has since been charged by prosecutors in the Southern District of New York in that hush money case, which implicated the president himself in effectively laundering money through the Trump Organization in order to make an illegal campaign contribution. We know that Mueller has since charged Cohen with lying to Congress about the Trump Organization and their dealings with the Trump Tower Moscow project during the presidential campaign. So, again, we don't have any clear window into why Michael Cohen is all of a sudden no longer testifying to Congress this week. And members of Congress who were expecting his testimony seem to be not at all bothered by that today, not at all bothered by that tonight. They say the delays are in the interest of the investigation, and they won't explain any further. So we don't have a clear window into what all of that means, but we can see the various dots here. It's just a question of how they connect. It seems clear that something is afoot here, that something is brewing, but we will continue to watch that story tonight as it continues to develop.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.